legalizefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. legalizefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is John Waters, who joins us to discuss science, spirituality and the coronavirus crisis, amongst many other things. In a wide-ranging conversation, we move from mainstream media manipulation to meaning and purpose in life, faith and the existence of a higher power, the meaning of freedom and our growing obsession with so-called safety, science as the new religion, and a spiritual battle and assault on human consciousness which now threatens our survival. Something very dark is unfolding at this time which cannot simply be explained away in the name of a public health emergency. Hello and welcome, John, and thank you so much for joining us today on legalizefreedom.com.
Pleasure, Greg. Nice to be with you.
Today, John, we're going to be talking about a lot of the events of the last year and a half. People might be a little bit jaded with all that now, but your recent writings around this area have been extremely thought-provoking and a lot of value there for readers. But before we dive into that, for people who don't know, just give us a quick potted bio of your career and what you do.
Well, I'm kind of a former journalist. I'm still a writer, and I write articles and essays, but I don't want to be called a journalist anymore, you know. I regard journalism as a kind of a completely corrupted and, morally defective activity at this stage. So, but I started off as a music journalist, rock and roll, with a music magazine called Hot Press, which was in Dublin. And I moved from there to various other alternative mags, which were kind of, beginning to pop up in the late 70s and early 80s. And I was an editor of a couple of those for a while during the 80s. And then I kind of moved into the mainstream, and I ended up in the Irish Times as a columnist for something like 20-odd years. I can't remember exactly. I started in 1991 and went on to 2014, whatever that is, 24 years. And so since then I've been kind of... I've written several books. I've written 10 books actually, and I'm mainly about Ireland, mainly about aspects of Ireland, also aspects of what you might call spiritual. No, spirituality is the wrong word. It's and religion is the wrong word, and faith is the wrong word. But it's something about the transcendent dimension of human beings, including myself. And I've written a couple of books about my own journey, as it were. I hate that word too, but my own experience in that area, and trying to kind of extrapolate from that, because fundamentally I think that has been the spine of our civilization for 2,000 years, and we're in serious danger of losing it, and we should start to really think about it, not just from the societal point of view, but from the personal point of view. And so I've been kind of out on the fringes now for the last 6 or 7 years. And I've written for First Things, I've written for The Spectator, I've published a couple of more books, and now in the last sort of 18 months, I guess you say, I've been fixated, I would say, on what's actually happening, because I think actually this is it now. This is the whole point of everything, and this is why we were put here, as it were, and this is why I was a journalist, and this is why I was writing for all those years, that this is the culmination of everything. In fact, it may very well be the end of the world, for all I know.
Yeah, it's funny how the more you work with words, the more you realise that the limitations of words, that way of expressing, because you were expressing your slight dissatisfaction with a couple of word choices there, but what else have we got? I know a lot of people really dislike the term spirituality as well, especially when you talk about it as, spiritual but not religious, that cliche.
Yeah. Yeah. You kind of short circuit people's understanding by using words like that. They trip, and it's very annoying because I don't mean, because also, spirituality can mean like, I don't know, incense and crystals, and that's not what I mean either. I mean fundamentally the kind of raw, real, and very practical dimension of the human being that is connected to the infinite and the absolute, that is kind of has come here from God knows where and is going God knows where, and that is, whether that's true or not, as it were, factually, that defines this journey, because there is no other possible way of handling this journey other than to have those two, beginnings, origins, and destination in mind all the time. And, at some level, in the imagination, that's what I mean. And so that's why I find religion interesting, and Catholicism, Christianity in particular, I think has been very important in that way, although, of course, there's many, many aspects of it that are very disquieting and indefensible in some respects. But there you go. Lots of things are like that.
Well, we'll come back to, for want of a better word, spirituality again shortly. But your journey again with these words that we don't like using was interesting to me because you mentioned Hot Press, the magazine. Mostly music, but I think there was some politics in it as well. I wasn't actually a reader of it. I read sounds instead because that was easier to get. This is basically, sort of like mid-80s onward. And I got my start in journalism with music as well. So, I started a fanzine in 1987 and then got my first published piece from Money, actual cash money. They sent me a check, I seem to remember, was in 1990, and I got out of it gradually sort of untangled myself from it. Probably the last thing I wrote about music was probably 4 or 5 years ago. It wasn't because I felt the whole thing had become corrupted somehow, though I saw plenty of that at various, levels, more sort of low level brown envelope stuff. But I just couldn't make a living at it anymore. The music business had changed so much that, the mechanical business of it is actually selling albums and whatnot, and younger people not buying magazines, and it just became untenable. So I just had I thought I'm just going to get out of this altogether, and I haven't regretted it, to be honest.
Yeah, and the journalism of music journalism had changed profoundly as well. I know certainly over the span of my life in that area, when it was the thing I was doing, there was the NME, and there was people like Ian Penman and Paul Morley, and like. They weren't everybody's taste, but they were pretty interesting kind of guys. And then it became more kind of formulaic and perfunctory and just, the facts, ma'am, and it was kind of, I think, well, that's true of a lot of journalism as well. I think that, like journalism in general became uneconomic too, in general, in recent times. I've been astonished, since I went back into what you might call the freelance market, to do the odd article for magazines, how little they pay. It's quite remarkable. It's astonishing, actually. Like they just kind of, especially if you're just doing it for their websites, they just give you like a total pittance for an article that might take you several days to write, and that's just to be the way it is, So it's become journalism. It's finished, really. And you might actually add to that in general. Now, I don't mean in this particular context, but you might add in general, and a good thing too, because it's so terrible now and has become so corrupted. It's the behaviour of journalism in this present scamdemic situation is just beyond belief, and you kind of think, well, what are they doing? I'd love to. Well, I wouldn't love to, but I'd be interested in meeting some of my old colleagues in some kind of neutral situation and just take a half an hour to ask them some very basic questions like, did you not mean any of the things you said? Did you not believe in anything? Did you not believe in freedom at all? Why are you silent? Why are you still a journalist if you can't? Why are you still churning out rubbish every day? When you see what's happening, you must see. Are you blind? That kind of thing. I don't know. I don't want to be sanctimonious about it. I suppose it does sound sanctimonious to a journalist, but I've never seen anything like this. I couldn't have imagined this happening. That essentially the entire journalistic profession would hand over its authority to governments and allow government to use it as a conduit of propaganda, which is to say lies.
Well, we see what happens. It's not 100% of mainstream journalists. It can be a bit difficult to say what is mainstream these days. I mean, you can look at audience figures or whatever, or sales, but there's a lot of, where does the mainstream end and something else begin? Because you can look at a lot of papers, just to use an example of newspapers, print, that would have been, would have sold millions in the 80s. And it's amazing how some of these news organizations have shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. And they're still, they're still acting like that they have the world's ear, but in many cases they really don't.
No, they don't. No, they don't. They're pretty, I mean, that is true. Virtually nobody reads a lot of the stuff in newspapers now. They look at the headlines. The type underneath is just to fill the space. I wrote an article there some months ago about the kind of future of the industry, and I suggested that we should scrap the newspaper and replace it with the use-paper, which is like, because newspapers are actually such useful things around the house, for defrosting your fridge. You can put it on the floor, it soaks up the water as the ice melts. If you want to clear out your ashes in the morning from your wood burning stove, if you want to clean windows, a newspaper is really good for it. And actually it'd be much better for it if there wasn't any print on it. And then it occurred to me that actually, imagine if you could actually have a full newspaper every day, if you've got kids, and nothing on it but the masthead, like the New York Times or the Irish Times or the Guardian, nothing else, blank, and give it to your kids on a rainy day. They would just stay quiet, drawing pictures on the newspaper. So I actually think that you could actually rescue the newspaper industry by just getting rid of the articles, and I think that would be a really major improvement.
Well, we saw the dash for toilet paper during the early days of the pandemic, didn't we?
That's exactly right, Greg. I mean, it's amazing actually, because that occurred to me as well. It's a little bit crude, obviously, but when we were kids, that's what people used to do. Like, you just cut up the local paper and put a hole in the corner, or little squares, and then put a hole and hang it on the lavatory wall. So let's go back to that. I mean, maybe we're going to have to anyway. When they've completely nuked the world, we probably will. I mean, they've just tanked the whole thing now. And that's kind of where we're going anyway, whether we like it or not.
Well, if they stopped having print on the paper, then you could actually use it for wrapping up fish and chips again, couldn't you? Because I always thought it tainted the food. I know they'd put greaseproof paper inside as well, but Yeah.
See, I know this sounds ironic and like a joke, but I actually think it would be an amazing thing if you could go into a newspaper and buy 16 pages, huge pages of blank paper for, I don't know, £2. You'd buy it. You'd buy it every few days. You definitely would. It's very useful in all kinds of ways. Oh, yeah.
Now, we spoke about spirituality, or should we, how I often characterize it is just, you said transcendent, and you might have used the word dimension, and that's a very good phrase. And clearly, I think increasing numbers of people are seeking access to something like that, or are beginning to dwell on it. It's beginning to dawn within their consciousness that this is something that is part of being human. And I think this is from your book, Lapsed Agnostic, you talk about your journey from belief to unbelief and back again. And is that how you would characterize that sort of, that arc, Yeah,
yeah, definitely. I mean, the thing in the middle, the kind of the moment of understanding, which is a very elongated moment of comprehension, was my battle with drink, my battle with alcohol. I became an alcoholic, and I ended up going into AA through various circumstances, and at that point, I wouldn't have ever called myself an atheist. I was too lazy to be an atheist, I think, but I definitely would have been an agnostic, and so that's why I call lapsed agnostic. But, I kind of thought when I went into AA that I couldn't really get what the God thing was about, because they have this concept of God as we understand him, which is basically saying that, you need to have a higher power in your life, and whatever way you can imagine that, then that's fine for the beginning anyway. And so I couldn't really get my head around this. How did this come into it? You know what I mean? I didn't really understand that, and it took me quite a while to grasp that actually this is about the structure of the human. And addiction, alcoholism, is about the structure of the human also. That actually, when you kind of latch onto one thing in reality, in human reality, you kind of do short-circuit your whole being. That we are born, we come in here, it seems, primed with a kind of an infinite desire, and desire for something infinite, something that can't be found, something, you can call it God if you want, or you can call it the moon if you want, or whatever, but it's something beyond ourselves. And in some way that defines us, that kind of, it kind of is like our where we get the power from, and if you think that's not true, or if you decide, well, I'm not going to live to that logic, then things start to go wrong and you short circuit. And that's where alcoholism and addictions of various kind come in. Because you actually essentially try to replace that remote source of your existence with something within yourself, which isn't possible. And so that's what I think addiction is, and alcoholism is. And then what you actually have to do in order to make yourself better is actually restore that remote source of your being and your power. And that's essentially, in a nutshell, what the program of Alcoholics Anonymous does. And actually that is what religion does and has done for, eons. And so I started to kind of start rethinking all this stuff from there. And then it's, they say in AA, which I didn't really believe when I said at first, that, you will end up in the religion of origin, where you started, essentially. I said, yeah, right. But actually I did. For a while, and I'm not, I kind of come and go in my head from all that, from the Catholic thing, because I go through good, as I go through good and bad periods with it, it goes through bad and good periods of its own volition. And it's certainly going through a bad one now, so I'm kind of pulling a little bit back from it, but they're having good, rich periods. I think the period of Pope Benedict XVI was an extraordinarily rich period in the church, because he had such a profound grasp of the world and what's wrong with it, and how the problems of the world relate to the problem of that loss of God in the imagination of man. And so those are the kind of things that I'm interested in. Obviously there's a kind of an observance and a prayer element to all that as well. Obviously I'm not just, I do believe in something someone I call God. But it's not, I'm not a holy Joe. I'm not I'm not interested in a kind of a recreational Christianity. There's a lot of that around, where people are trying to see it as an identity, as, there's a way of sort of exhibiting themselves in the world. This is me, and I believe in this, and this, I know all these prayers off by heart, and I believe in these prophecies, and I believe in these miracles, and so on and so forth. I'm not really like that. Everybody assumes because I talk about it that I am like that, and I'm going to be like them, and there's at least a lot of misunderstanding, and I try not to get into arguments with people about it. But to me, it's actually about the imagination. It's about the imagination of man, and I think that's, you actually look to the larger frame of society, of civilization, you see that it is religion, it is God that has enlarged the imagination of mankind to create massive civilizations which have been hugely successful in lots of ways. So I'm interested in all that, and that's kind of my main focus, although I do have a kind of, obviously I have a religious life myself. I do have a prayer life, and that's kind of whatever it is, but I'm not gospel greedy in that sense. I mean, I know I was steeped in the Gospels growing up, because we were all the time in the church, and I know all the stories almost by heart. So that's kind of roughly where I am, and I come and go. Sometimes I find it very hard to hang on, because it's very hard to believe in God in the modern world, for reasons that Pope Benedict spoke about in an amazing speech he gave in the Bundestag in 2011, where he talked about man having built a bunker to live in so he could shut out the mystery, shut out God. In other words, that he wanted a world that he could completely control and understand, and didn't need anything else, any other reference point, and that there was nothing mysterious to him. So I'm interested in all of these things, and I try to talk about these things. But unfortunately, you see, everything kind of, that when you speak about Catholicism, then people assume one thing, that you're an apologist for the church as it is, or that you kind of, believe in mad stuff. I mean, I used to get all kinds of storytelling asking me, oh, well, well, on the one hand, there's evolution, and there's, on the other hand, we're doing a project. I'm doing an essay about, the two different forms of belief. I've been talking to people who believe in the evolution, and you obviously don't believe in that, so you believe in something else. Can you explain what you believe in? And I say, well, I kind of do believe in evolution, but it's in a slightly different way. It's a bit more complicated than what these guys believe in. But it's not that I have any kind of, they kind of think that you're, a creationist means something other than being an evolutionist, but it actually doesn't. Because, to think that it does would make God a very stupid person, so, I'm kind of interested in all that stuff, but the level of discourse about this in public society now, or indeed anywhere, pretty much in the public realm, it's not all that interesting.
A Christian colleague of mine recently, we'd been having a conversation about political correctness and Jordan Peterson, and he sent me a video that he was quite impressed by, and this is Jordan Peterson post his sojourn in Russia, and his illness, and he said to me, this colleague, he said, I think Jordan Peterson is a person who's on a journey of faith. I thought, that's interesting. So I checked out the video, and I've not watched it all yet because it's a long one. But Peterson did seem to be beginning to contemplate the possibility that there was, talking about this transcendent dimension we're talking about. He did seem to be approaching that, and he certainly began to get very emotional. His voice was cracking up. He's not quite. He's probably 90% of himself after what happened to him. The reason I bring this up was because I thought it was interesting that this was happening to someone, or appears to be happening to someone like him. But around about that time, when I got the video, I then read your piece when you were speaking about Peterson's somewhat odd lack of commentary on the COVID situation.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing. I have been monitoring that, and I've seen, I think, that interview and a couple of other places where he talked to people about this over the years. And I've always had this feeling that he was kind of, that he's kind of trapped in a kind of a rational kind of mindset, And, I think it is possible to make a journey into faith through reason. In fact, I think it's essential. But it's not the only part of it. You also need to make that leap of faith, and that you kind of, what you were saying earlier, that you kind of need to accept that actually language is a very limited instrument for understanding these kind of concepts, and that actually you kind of need to kind of have a kind of a wordless understanding of these things, and that kind of, for me, is somewhere where faith is more, in that kind of wordless sense of certainty, which isn't kind of a fist-clenching kind of faith, belief, a determination to believe in spite of everything, but it's a kind of a sense of ease based on something like the idea that you can't actually sit here in the middle of everything and really seriously believe in nothing. That's kind of my fundamental thing, that it's not reasonable to actually be in the middle of everything and to believe in nothing. I had that conversation with my daughter years ago when she was a little girl, and she got, and like, what if there's nothing, Dad? What if there's nothing? Because she'd heard this, and I said, well, here we are, and you're in the middle of Spain, you're in the middle of the world. Like, at the time she was, I forget, maybe 12, and I said, 13 years ago, you didn't exist, as far as we know, and certainly not in this dimension. And now here you are, and there's nothing but things and sounds and colours and noises and reality and life. what kind of thinking is it that would lead you to believe that this can only happen once for a short time? The Mediterranean is there. Did you imagine that when 13 years ago, wherever you were? How then can you expect to imagine where you will be in 130 years' time? So that's my kind of sense of what this is all about. It's about imagination more than it's about anything else. I don't even like the word faith, I have to say, because it suggests a kind of a clinging on to something implausible. I think there's lots of evidence that God must exist. God is a very loose word and ambiguous word and all that, but, the thing that we would call God, it must exist for all these reasons and for others. Colleagues often say to me, come on, you're an intelligent guy and you must, you understand stuff and, how can you possibly say that you believe that the Son of God came to earth and stayed here for 33 years and, died on the cross and then came back? And I said, well, sure, that's pretty implausible. I agree. I don't disagree with that. But it's not nearly as implausible as the fact that right here now, today, on whatever it is, 31st of July, 2021, I, a 66-year-old being called John Waters, is actually here looking out on this world. I didn't do that. I couldn't do that. I didn't make that happen. Something made that happen. And that something is what I'm interested in. Not just because it's me, but because it's everything. And I just think this is such a basic, alternative way of seeing the whole concept of the transcendent. What I'm saying is really that, as going back to Benedict and his bunker, that bunker is actually the core thing we need to focus on, because that's what's blocking out our sense, our imaginative understanding of reality in its totality.
Well, I think fundamentalist materialism, as in, the view of the world that five senses, that's all there is. If it can't be detected by those, it doesn't exist, even though cats and dogs can detect more light and sound than we can. And that there's this 3D world is all there is. And, either side of your birth and death is a black void of nothingness. That worldview, and this is not meant to be anti-science, it's anti-scientism. That's what's brought us, I think, to where we are now. That's what's brought us to this state. And, of course, not all peoples of the world have the same worldview. A lot of indigenous communities still have a very, very different view of creation. But it's that excessive materialism that has brought us into this mess. And what are people looking for? And you pointed this out in your recent writings. People have been looking for meaning, whether they realized it or not, even in denying meaning. And we've spoken about addiction. That in many ways that's a way of hiding from what you're here for, just covering it up, just blocking it out. And unfortunately now we see this manifestation of a craving for meaning bubbling up in current affairs, and a lot of it is now being transferred over onto the pandemic response, which is a very unfortunate turn of events. Maybe something good can come out of that ultimately. I don't know.
I don't think so, because it's actually the wrong way around. It's actually a fear of death. It's a more enhanced fear of death. What we need to do is actually, make death invisible. I don't mean in the way in the world. That's not the point, but that we kind of, disregard this whole thing of the finality of death. Even that's a hard thing to do, of course, and it's almost impossible in the culture now. But that kind of what I mean is that's what we need to do. And that was really true, I think, of when people had what people now patronizingly call a simple faith, a simple belief. People did actually see that kind of thing as like it's just a curtain you walk through, and then you just continued. And I think we need to get back to that somehow or other. The great problem, going back to Peterson, and I can see what he's engaged in imaginatively, and it's very interesting. And although there's a block, I think, personally with him. I'd love to talk to him about this, but we live in a world that makes faith impossible. That's the real problem. And yet what he says is absolutely true, that in order to function fully as human beings, we need to act as if God exists. But the paradox is to see, can you really act as if, that's what he says he does. But I asked this question, can you actually act as if God exists if you're not reasonably certain that he does? See, I don't think you can. Like, in some ways you can act out ritual, and of course some societies are much better at that than we have been. We kind of abandoned the ritualistic aspects as well. Like, Spain is better, for example, at that. If you're in Spain, particularly in Andalusia or those kind of more old-fashioned places, at the various feast days, like, there are massive processions through the villages and so on, and it's quite beautiful. We don't do that anymore in Ireland. It's almost gone. Corpus Christi and all that is barely recognised now in most of the towns in Ireland. But so the question is, can you actually fake it? Fake belief. That's the thing that I've written about recently in AA. You see, that's kind of what AA encourages you to do when you go in and you're an atheist or an agnostic. It encourages you to imagine God, to fake it till you make it, fake belief until you make it. And even if you can't, then to continue to sort of regard something else as the source of your being or of your power, whether it's a dead relative or something like that. And the idea is that fundamentally, there was a book written about AA in the very early stages, which is a very intriguing title, which kind of captures this. It was a German guy called Kirst. It was a kind of a biography of AA, and it was called Not God. And what it was saying was that in AA, the first and foremost lesson that you need to learn to get sober is that you are not God. That there is something else beyond you that is greater than you. Because, of course, this is the pathology of the addict. It's the kind of, they call it like the egomaniac with an inferiority complex, so there's all of those things going on. So when Peterson, I'm interested in what he's doing, and I saw those things, but I think the emotionalism is misleading because he's quite fragile, yes, and he breaks down very easily. I'm not in any way disparaging that. I do that sometimes myself, and it's not a bad thing necessarily, but I can see that he's very fragile. But I would be interested in actually talking to him, because he kind of gets lost in he talks to theologians and stuff, and that's a big mistake, because they're talking about things that are so involuted, that they're not real, and it's misleading him into thinking you can construct a faith with words and images and ideas. Not really, it's got to be rooted in your imagination about how this world, you've got to look at the world and you cannot see randomness, and I can't see randomness in the world. I cannot believe that is possible.
Everywhere you look, there is patterns, repeating patterns, like you look up fractals in nature, for example. You could go to the structure of the brain compared to the structure of the galaxy. There's umpteen examples bobbing around in popular science, and everywhere you look, I see order and chaos, but I see natural teleology. It's like there's a striving towards what I don't know, but there appears to be something's going on. That's the best word I can think of, is striving in ourselves. Right down to amoeba. There's some kind of movement, forward movement.
Well, that's right. And very often this whole idea that there's some kind of divide between science and religion is completely bogus. Because, modern science grew out of Christianity, first of all. And secondly, when they do that, what they do is they only show you or allow you to see or hear from a select group of scientists. There are scientists out there who can actually bring religion and science together very well. Somebody like Rupert Sheldrake, for example. But you don't hear much of their kind of marginal figures, and they're kind of regarded as some sort of eccentric. But Sheldrake is a brilliant scientist, apart from the fact that he actually understands. He believes in the transcendent idea and lots of related concepts. And so this is all, of course, part of the dumbing down of society, which we can see with kind of to an extraordinary extent now in the last 18 months. You know, that young people in particular, they're actually really dumbed down. And I don't think it's coincidental that they're the first generation in a long time in the Western Hemisphere, really, and particularly I know in Ireland, looking at them very microscopically, that have had no religious training in any way, sense or form. You know, they just don't have any religious imagination whatsoever, any transcendent imagination. They sneer at it, and that they think that makes them clever. They think that makes them cleverer than Rupert Sheldrake, you know, which is absurd.
I'll recommend to listeners they check out Rupert's book, Science and Spiritual Practices, where he brings these worlds together, you know, through the lens of his own life. And I also did an interview with him around that. So if they want a quick version, they could check that out. Well, speaking as someone who is not religious, but one of the things that's really struck me, I was reminded of it in your comments about young people and religious training, is the churches in general. I can't speak for every church all around the world, but certainly thinking about the UK and Ireland, the response of the church, or lack of response to the church from the pandemic situation and lockdown, it just, you know, this strange silence. You know, maybe you can throw a bit of light on the situation in Ireland, but certainly here in England, with the Church of England, it's been you know, just nothing but perfunctory things to say about it, really. Just, you know, the usual, oh yeah, no surprises, no inspiration, nothing really to assist, you know, a congregation in navigating these tumultuous times. And of course, we saw closed doors as well. You know, for some people, the pandemic situation was so extreme that it pushed them to do something they maybe hadn't done for a very long time, which is go to a church to seek something, you know, just as a space to be. And in many cases are met with closed doors. So it's all been, you know, when the church is required to step up, they seem to have stepped down.
Yeah, it's been, of course, a very extraordinary thing, and I can't say that I understand it completely. I mean, I was astonished by it because I started encountering it fairly on in communications with certain priests that I knew and people like that, and watching and hearing stories, and then even, you know, as recently as yesterday, you know, a woman told me about where she rang a priest looking for confession. She had been a recent convert back to Catholicism, and he basically bawled her out of it. You know, he said that she could do her own confession. He told her, which is completely news to me. You know, because of the pandemic, it seems. You know, but the first inclination I had was that, you know, like a priest I knew in America, and who was a really fundamentalist kind of guy, and you know, what other people would call a traditionalist and right wing, and you know, all that. Basically was hiding away. And when I kind of said this is a bit of a scam, and he was really outraged at the idea, and that there would be any expectation that he would actually have to go out and do sick calls, like it was like anathema to him, and he was just not doing it. And that kind of was borne out then when you saw the way the church was behaving, closing its churches, like in no argument, no discussion, no masses, no Eucharist, no nothing. And not alone that, but then they allowed thousands of people to die alone without the sacraments. Like, this is shameful, carry on. And I mean, one of the things that seems clear is that they took absolutely literally from word go. You see, this is the amazing thing to me, that a church which is there to kind of challenge the world, which is, you know, supposed to be, you know, under the leadership of Satan, right? This is the world. And they go by the logic of the world all the time. You know, they watch TV to find out what's true. Well, you know, I just find this fantastic. You're supposed to, like, part of what you do as a priest, for example, is that you're a leader of the flock. Therefore, you have to think through everything. And you think about, you know, and you must think the unthinkable. But they weren't thinking anything, least of all the unthinkable. So I just find this absolutely mind-boggling. And now we see in Ireland, certainly, and I think maybe less so in Britain, actually. Interesting, I saw a thing where there was something like 1,200 bishops came out, or prelates came out recently against the vaccination mandates and all that. But in Ireland, the priests are essentially urging their congregations to take the vaccine, which is again preposterous. And it's all based on this, predicated on this extraordinary idea that there's a massive pandemic going on, when in fact there is zero evidence for any pandemic other than what's on the news.
That concludes part 1 of our interview. Part 2 will be available soon in the subscribers area at legalizefreedom.com.
legalizefreedom.com